Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Our guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Johnny D Boggs, who may be the preeminent Western writer at work today. He certainly is among the most honored. Johnny began his career as a writer in the sports department at major newspapers in Texas, before leaving to freelance and write novels and short fiction. Sparked by a love of the films of John Ford and TV westerns, he began to investigate what he calls the True West. A remarkable body of work followed and continues. His most recent novel is Bloody Newton, the story of the deadliest gunfight in the Old West, and so much more. Johnny is a 9-time winner of the Spur Award from the Western Writers of America, that's a record, for his novels and short fiction. He contributes to True West, Western Art and Architecture, and Wild West magazines. In 2020, he was inducted into the Western Writers Hall of Fame, joining great Western writers he admires, including Fred Groves, A.B. Guthrie, Dorothy M. Johnson, and Jack Schaefer. He is an exceptional storyteller. Johnny D Boggs, welcome to Writers at Work.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
I read somewhere that you began writing at a very early age and you sold some of your stories to classmates. Is that true?
That's very true. I tell people my royalties were a lot better back then. As it started in third grade, and when we were in the English part of the class, the teacher said, "Write a tale." And I was like, "What?" And it's like, "Yes, just make something up. Just write whatever you want to write." And I have no idea what I wrote. I have no memory of that whatsoever, but I just remember that feeling that I got when I was doing this. And I said, "Hey, this is pretty cool." And then, my classmates would start asking me to, write a story for them. So that's, and I was a hack writer. I was like, writing for the pulps. If it was
Yes.
science fiction, okay. Horror, okay. Detective story, sure. Not too many westerns though,
Really?
yeah. But that's how I started it out. I just
Yeah.
started writing.
I admire the hustle, but I have to say that what that little story tells me is that you had a love of the written word at a very early age.
Well, I did. My parents were very avid readers, and I think that helped a little bit. And I just like the idea of telling stories.
Yeah. Like many of us who grew up at a time when Westerns dominated primetime viewing, you were drawn to Western films and TV programming. But do you recall when you began reading Tales of the Old West?
Uh, I remember seventh grade English class. Um, we were one of the stories we were assigned to read was Conrad Smoke Over
Okay.
the Prairie, and I read that and I said, "Hey, this is neat. This is yeah, because this is different from some of the TV shows I've been watching and a few films, and it was a good story. And Conrad Richard, of course, was an excellent writer, and that started it there. Then I started finding, yeah, but I grew up in South Carolina, so the selections for westerns was kind of few at the time. I mean, that the only thing you could find were Louis L'Amour novels,
Mm.
and I read those, and they were okay, but it even at my young age, I realized, yeah, this is the same story he wrote last time. It's just a different character, a different name, and you know how it's going to end. But then this was also the time when it started to be used bookstores started opening up, and I would go in there, and then I would find some of the older books, Shane and Monty Walsh and some of those, and I started reading and reading and reading, and that kind of got me interested, and I just kept up. And I said that this is kind of what I want to do. And you grow up in South Carolina, and I grew up on a tobacco farm in the swamps in the northeastern part of the state. I mean, one thing that you really appreciated when you watch a movie of the West, hey, there are no swamps. There are no these thick forests where you can't see
Right,
anything.
right.
It was just a different place to be, and that was where I wanted to be. So
Uh-huh. Was there a particular writer that you thought could serve as a model for you?
I always point out to, well, obviously first, Conrad Richter, but Jack Schaefer, Shane, Monty Walsh, and his short stories, and Dorothy M. Johnson. I was probably in college, and I was about a freshman in college, I believe, and I walked. There was a bookstore, a newsstand that had books right across the street from where my dorm was, and I walked in there one day and found the Hanging Tree and Other Stories by Dorothy M. Johnson, and I picked that up and I read that, and that really got me hooked, and that's when I really got kind of serious about, hey, this is something that I'd like to be just like Dorothy M. Johnson and Jack Schaefer. And I
Mhm.
started writing and writing in college a little more seriously now. And I had enough sense to realize, what I'd like to do is write for a living. But I had enough sense to say, you probably just don't write your first book and get it published, stuff like that. You probably need to do something while you're trying to figure out how you get published. And uh, I just majored in journalism, and the University of South Carolina, a pretty good J school, and I did that, and that taught me a little bit. I mean, one thing about newspaper writing is that it teaches you have to write everything. There's no, you might want to be doing this story, but this might not be the story you get, and it also tells you get both sides of the story.
Yeah. When you went to newspapers in Texas, was that intentional?
Yes, yes, and and yeah, I applied. My senior year, I was sending out clips and resumes and cover letters to any place out west because I said this is where I want to be. And it just so happened. Well, one of my professors in college, he stopped me in the hallway and said, "Hey, I know I just met. I understand you want to go west." And I had a couple of short stories published in the student literary magazine, and they were both westerns.
Ah,
And yeah, and he said, "Okay, here's a name. I just met this guy at a conference in Atlanta. Um, write him. Tell him I said." Use my name. Say I asked you to write him, and then the rest is up to you. Send him a resume and some clips, and the rest is up to you. And I sent that, and I always say I don't know what photos he had of this guy. He was an assistant managing editor at the Dallas Times Herald, and they happened to be. It was just pure luck. They happened to be expanding their suburban coverage, so they were hiring a lot of young, mostly fresh out of college, um, journalists to take over the beat there, and I just happened to be one of the four sports writers that they picked. Um, so that's how it started. That got me out west, and it got me a good job, at a good newspaper,
sure.
and there was a whole lot of training going on there too. So, but I
Yeah.
was in Texas, and I said, "Hey, this is pretty good." And then after a while, Texas, and newspapers is fun. I mean, it was really fun when you're working in Dallas in the 1980s. That was really fun, and I was working with a tremendous amount of talented journalists. I'm learning a lot about the newspaper business. But by the time you hit your 30s, it starts getting kind of old, and you get kind of burned out on that. And when I was, in my mid 30s, I was married, and I was writing. I was starting to freelance a little bit, magazine articles, mostly nonfiction. I was doing some short stories and getting those published, but I just had this whim. I said, we were sick of Dallas, sick of the heat, sick of the crime, sick of just about everything. And I just said, told my wife, we had been to Santa Fe just for a couple times, and we just come back from there. I knew nothing about Santa Fe, New Mexico. I just knew that it was cool, it was mountains, and it seemed like a nice place to live. And I told her she was working days, I was working nights, so we never saw each other. And the joke was that her friends would say I was a figment of her imagination. Uh, but I said, hey, why don't we just sell the house? Uh, we moved to Santa Fe. You get a job, you get a full time job. I'll stay home and write all the time. And she said, that's a great idea.
So
And
I'm sorry, Johnny. Go ahead,
yeah,
please.
no, that's the way it worked.
So the, there's always this sort of idea that a journalist then wants to become a fiction writer and has to make a choice. But you continued to do both, didn't you?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. And,
And a lot of that's because the Western market is it was never been what it was back in the in the heyday. So I figured, yeah, you need to do this. And the other thing was, and I tell young writers this there's no such thing as job stability. Um, you you write, and if the book doesn't sell, uh, you might be out of a job. And the same thing for when you're freelancing for magazines. And I also learned fairly quickly if you tell an editor no, editors don't like rejection any more than writers like rejection. So if you tell an editor no, they're going to find somebody else, and they're probably not going to call you again.
yeah, I just finished Bloody Newton, which I really loved.
Well, thank you.
Um, oh, I really did, Johnny, and I consider it narrative nonfiction. Do you?
Yeah. I mean, I tell people don't quote me on your term paper. I make things up, and but yeah, I mean, I do as much historical research as I can for most of the writing, and then you let your imagination take over. And one thing I will point out on Bloody Newton, the gunfight. I mean, it, it's kind of I mean, it's fairly an accurate description of what we know or what they think happened in that bloody gunfight. That's the climax of the book. Um, but I also tweaked some of the facts around that, just to make it fit into the story I was telling and make the main characters, a little more involved. But
Yeah.
yeah, I do try to keep the facts as close to the historical record as possible.
Isn't that the definition of narrative nonfiction, though? That
Yeah,
that
but I always think narrative nonfiction. I mean, if you're really writing narrative nonfiction, you're keeping the facts the way they are. You're
right?
keeping and you're trying. It's nonfiction. Let's say this thing. Nonfiction is nonfiction. Fiction is fiction.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm a very strong believer that nonfiction writers need to keep all the facts straight. And like Hampton Sides. I know Hampton. He's a great writer of narrative nonfiction. I mean, it's more
right.
entertaining than academic nonfiction, but he gets his facts right, and he stays with the facts. So I mean, that's the main thing. I mean, when sometimes when narrative nonfiction will turn me off is when you start saying this is what this guy was thinking, or you go out of the realm of nonfiction, out of the realm of journalism, let's say, and into the realm of you start making things up, and that's where I start getting a little bit saying, this really doesn't work for me. You're telling me what this fellow was thinking or this woman was thinking. Say there was a book about there was a book about James Stewart in World War II when he was when he was in the Air Force, and it was started saying this is what Jimmy Stewart was thinking when he's flying these planes and over these bombing runs, and I'm saying Stewart never talked about that or rarely talked about so that's getting way it breaks it breaks my believability and say if you're making this part up, what else are you making up?
Yeah, yeah.
So
No, I think Johnny, that's an issue for those of us who were trained as journalists.
yeah,
I mean, we need to adhere to fact,
right,
and for more than a framework. I heard a story when I first got into the business from a writer about a writer I really admired, and an editor said to him, these two streets don't intersect in that city, and he said, well, now they do, and that it really bothered me. It bothered me that
right,
it would be so easy to make it adhere to fact.
right, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
that bothers me too. And the other thing I always said, when I'm writing this, I mean, the one thing that they teach you as a reporter to get both sides of the story and get as many sides of the story as you can. And I try to do that when I'm doing the research. And we always say, someone says this happened, someone says it happens this way, and the truth is probably somewhere in between.
Yeah. Yeah. When I came upon your author's note at the back of the book, it answered so many questions for me. Um, I never really got lost in the idea that I needed to know whether something happened or didn't. I think, and that's a tribute to your journalism, I would say, Johnny. I mean, you have a beautiful control over your storytelling abilities, but I always had the sense that you were being forthright in your descriptions of what happened.
Well, I try to be, and I think I mean, I do as much research as the other thing I say, you can keep researching and researching and researching and digging and digging and digging. At some point, you got to stop, uh, especially when you have a contract and an editor who's expecting this manuscript at such and such a date. So you do have to stop at some point, and you can keep digging and digging and digging, but you never get anything written. And that's another thing when I'm teaching that at a writer's workshop or stuff like that. I say, at some point, imagination. If you're writing fiction, the imagination has to take over, and you just have to let it go and see where it goes. But yes, I try to stay as close to the facts as possible.
Earlier I said that Bloody Newton is the tale of the deadliest gunfight in the American West. But, Johnny, I'd contend that this book would work without the gunfight. And for the listeners, let me explain. Um, it's the tale of, excuse me just a minute, it's the tale of a birth of a town, of a father, two sons, and his top hand, a woman who wants to run her restaurant in her own kind of way, and a woman journalist. And these characters are so finely wrought and distinct. They're much more than functional. Can you tell me about how you developed these characters and made them much more than archetypes?
History is history. People are people, and I always say people are what make history, and it's not history. I mean, history can help form the people, but I try to think, characters have to drive the story. I mean, characters are what you have to feel for, and you have to believe in these characters and believe they're real. And so my focus has always been on the characters. And yeah, what I Bloody Newton. Okay, I had done some cattle drive novels in the past for the publisher and my editor, and they sold okay, and they sold actually pretty well. And he said, "Can you do another one?" And another two, and he gave me a two. The first one was Longhorns East, which was about a cattle drive, an actual cattle drive. A guy from England um, migrated to the United States, and he wound up in Illinois. And he came down to Texas and picked up some herd in Texas, and he drove cattle from Texas to New York City in the 1850s before most people think that the cattle drives were actually happening. And that one sold well and got some really good reviews. So the next one, part of the two book deal, was Bloody Newton. And I think the only reason he picked Bloody Newton was because when I said, well, there was a town and there was a cattle town in Kansas called, and it got the nickname Bloody Newton, and had one of the most violent gunfights in history. And he said, "So let's do that." But he also said, and this, he said, you need at least one strong woman character because women buy more books than men. And I said, yeah, sure, I can do that. And I just thought, okay, let's talk about the formation of a town, how a cattle town comes to be, and let's figure out who can tell that story. And I said, well, let's have a newspaper journalist, and that can be a woman, and let's have someone who's just not you don't want the rancher's daughter, you don't want the saloon girl with the heart of gold, any of those cliches. So I said, how about some woman just starting a restaurant, because people have to eat, and every cattle town had a cafe or several restaurants, and sometimes some very high end restaurants. So let's make these two people, and then have the father with his sons coming up, and like a friend of basically the guy that really has the cattle, the rancher, and just have them driving up while the town is being founded. And then they come into Newton, and they all at some point they just interconnect.
I don't want to be overly flattering, Johnny, but uh,
Oh,
you,
flutter away, flutter away.
Cindy, the journalist, and Denise, the cook, They're really three-dimensional characters. They're just not, stopgap and placeholders. Uh, their emotions and their reaction to what's happening really does drive the story. And I think subtext moves to text when they are um, sussing out what's going on.
Right.
And I've had limited reading of the genre. I've watched millions of films and TV shows, but I don't remember coming across characters like these two women in in the Western genre.
Well, you don't see too many. I mean, yeah, I think you occasionally will see a female journalist. I actually wrote a nonfiction book on uh, newspaper journalists on film, and in westerns, there was a chapter on westerns, of course, and there were some a fair amount of movies that had a female journalist in the movies, but they're usually just cliche. You never. One thing that always bothered me about newspaper movies is you hardly ever see them actually, reporting or typing or whatever. They're usually just drinking.
But and then Johnny, you when she asks how do you spell the name,
Yeah,
it's so real. How do you spell that name? It's just and I loved Cindy, and it's as a writer, you have this tool now that gives you an interesting way to convey facts and summarize events
right.
via the story she's filing.
Right, and that was part of the idea when I said one of these should be a newspaper reporter, because that would get her there, and then she would be seeing everything. And if she's a decent reporter, um, she would be observing all this. I mean, that's one thing they tell you about newspaper reporters are you're a trained observer, so you're just not trying to collect all the facts. You're observing what's going on and trying to put that into the story. So yeah, she was one of them had to be a newspaper reporter, and the other one, I could have made her something else, but I thought a cook. I think that a restaurant, the person that likes food,
Yeah.
and a fairly strong woman.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for giving her an Italian grandmother, Johnny. When there's a certain point in the book, I forget what it was when she's describing how much garlic is needed in the food. I thought I'm going to that restaurant. So I visited your website, and boy,
Oh,
you've written a lot of books and short
yeah.
stories and articles. What's next from Johnny D Boggs?
I don't know. How about that?
Well,
I
get to
don't
work.
know.
Get to work.
Okay.
Stop talking and get to work.
I do, and it's on. I'm a film buff, of course, so it's on. It's tentatively titled "The War Movie Grows Up," and it's about the war films from 1945 to 1950, where they are moving away from propaganda and they're getting into the more gritty, realistic depictions of men in combat, and trying to push what the production code administration's rules on what you and the War Department's rules on what you could show and stuff. So this is when you get movies that don't make you want to be a soldier, and they're anything but propaganda, and they're anything but uh, pushing for total victory in the war. I mean, you get the story of GI Joe, which is about Ernie Powell and one of his most beloved columns, basically, and Sands of Iwo Jima, A Walk in the Sun, 12 O'Clock High, movies like that
Yeah.
that really, really were a lot more realistic about what happens in combat. So I want to do that. And that takes me on. Sometimes I say, well, let me get away from the Western for a minute and do something different. So there's that. But the next Western novel, yeah, we'll have to see how Bloody Newton sells, I guess. Let's see what
Oh,
happens.
I hope it sells well. I've been boasting about it to my friends. Will we hear from the Hardys again? That's the father and two sons, and I was thinking about them. The book opens with a beautiful scene with Hardy and his wife, and then by necessity, we don't hear from her for uh, a very long time, and then we do hear from her again, And I was thinking, boy, I'd like to know what she was doing all that time we were away. And now she's a grandmother. And anyway, uh, I love that, and I'm sure you do as a writer and a reader when the characters live beyond the confines of the story.
Well, yes, yes, and that's one of the things you and yeah, we'll see. We'll see. But I was kind of miffed. My editor uh, decided to put on the cover his idea of I don't know if it's a subtitle or what, the town from hell. So it's Bloody Newton, the town from hell, and I'm like, well, well, so much for me getting a book signing of Newton, Kansas.
Well, Johnny, listen, I love this book anyway. Our
Thank you.
guest has been Johnny D Boggs, whose latest Bloody Newton is a wonderful read, as I've made clear many, many times. Johnny, thank you so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Pleasure being here. Thanks you.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersaTworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.